Chapter 62, The Flute, Hanyu's POV. As soon as they were through the door, Hanyu knelt to remove Antony's shoes. "At least let me sit down," the god grumbled. "I'm still standing in those." "Oh, right." Hanyu flushed and scrambled to the chair, but Antony didn't follow him. "You don't need to do that, you know. I have hands." "Of course you do." Slender, lovely hands that held Hanyu so gently, even when he didn't deserve it. "But you also have an attendant. That's what I'm for, you know? Service and things." Service and things. Hanyu winced at his own fumbling. Antony was mistaken. He just had to be. Hanyu was as stupid as they came. Antony fidgeted for a moment, then tromped over to where Hanyu knelt. "If you really want to, you can. But it's not what you're for." Of course, now that he'd heard Antony describe the long months before the gods had found Taisha, Hanyu had little doubt that his most important role was to feed his master. That could almost feel demeaning. After all, it didn't take any skill or training to be fed from, but it was so important that Hanyu couldn't get terribly snippy about it, even in the privacy of his own mind. Anyhow, the move to his knees had been strategic. It felt like the most appropriate pose from which to make his apologies, but lately Antony got nervous if he bowed when they were alone. Hanyu wondered when and how that had happened. When he'd first been chosen, could it really have been only 2 months ago? He would never have dared to budge from his knees or even lift his head from the floor in the god's presence without explicit permission. Now, if he knelt at all, Antony assumed he was about to melt down. Hanyu tugged his mind back to the moment as he undid the laces. He took a deep breath. "I'm very sorry I kissed you last night, my lord. I understand if you don't want to allow me in your bed anymore after I abused the privilege." Hanyu wished he was allowed to ask for punishments so he could beg for anything other than that, but he knew it would be a fair and predictable consequence. If he couldn't behave himself in his god's bed, why should he be allowed in it? Antony didn't reply. The silence stretched long enough that Hanyu began to wonder, foolishly, given their proximity and Antony's divine hearing, whether he'd spoken too quietly. Just as he was about to repeat his apology, the god's hand came down on his head and began smoothing his hair. "Thank you," Antony said. "I appreciate that. But of course I'm not throwing you out of the bed." It was almost as good as when he'd said our rooms. It positioned Hanyu's presence in the bed as a natural state of affairs, which would have to be disrupted by throwing him out, rather than a special privilege which could be revoked to return them to normal. Hanyu leaned into Antony's gentle touch, basking in the knowledge that he was so much a part of his master's life. "Hanyu?" Antony's voice was soft and hesitant. When Hanyu looked up, the god closed his mouth and looked away. His demeanor suggested a blush, though Hanyu could see no hint of one on his cheeks. "Never mind." The god patted his head, his touch suddenly awkward. "I'd like to play some music. Would that bother you?" "Of course not." Hanyu stopped, struck by a realization, and whirled to stare up at his master. "Wait, you haven't played anything in over a month. Were you worried that I wouldn't like it?" Antony shrugged, scowling fiercely. "I just didn't want to listen to you griping about how you can't play." "You didn't want me to feel bad about being lousy at music." Hanyu couldn't repress his grin. He knew he shouldn't be pleased that his master was willing to forgo one of his favorite pastimes just to avoid upsetting him, and of course he would never want Antony to give up music, but he couldn't help relishing the thought that he was willing to do it. "Never mind," Antony growled. "We can just—" "No!" Interrupting hardly struck the penitent tone Hanyu had been planning, but oh well. "Please, I'm sorry. I want you to play. I can sing, remember? You can play, and I can sing, and I won't feel bad. I promise." Antony grumbled in response. "I wouldn't make promises about feelings if I were you. They're tricky bastards." Hanyu wasn't sure how to respond to that, but it didn't seem to matter. His god was standing and moving towards the bedroom, where he kept his instruments. When he returned, Hanyu was unsurprised to see the flash of silver in his hands. It was a simple little instrument Antony had called a flute, though it bore little resemblance to the flutes Hanyu knew. It was just a sleek silver tube with a mouthpiece at one end and holes lining the top, and it was clearly ancient. "That one's your favorite, isn't it?" Hanyu asked, pointing to the instrument. At the shadow that crossed Antony's face, he wished he hadn't said anything, but when his master responded, his voice was soft and even. "Yes, it was a present from my mother." her wedding gift to Valerius. He had always wanted to learn how to play one, but... A loose shrug. Well, I killed him before he got the chance. Hanyu was about to protest the reflective, almost casual self-recrimination in his god's voice, but Antony had already settled onto the sofa and resumed speaking. What would you like to sing? He asked. Hanyu swallowed his objections and settled at Antony's feet, leaning against his knees. It was quickly becoming his favorite pose. Well, aside from cuddling up to Antony in bed, and the time Antony carried him. You know I like love ballads, he replied, and his master groaned. Right, of course you do. Fine. Do you know The Prince and the Beggar Lad? That one's too sad. How is it sad? Antony demanded. They don't end up together. But that's good, the god argued. The prince is an asshole. The beggar lad can do better. She's not so bad. Hanyu had always identified with the prince in that song and felt the need to stick up for her. She didn't want to make the beggar pretend to be a lord. She just couldn't stand up to the king. Hanyu always imagined foreboding kings in stories as the high priest, so he knew he wouldn't have stood up to him either. Antony snorted. She's a coward. She ought to tell everyone that she loves the beggar lad exactly as he is and damn the consequences. Either that or leave the poor boy alone from the beginning. She would have, eventually, if he'd just given her some time. And what if she doesn't? Then he's stuck waiting around forever. No, it's better if he goes off and finds someone who can give him what he needs right from the beginning. This argument wasn't going anywhere. What about Sweet Choco? The prince and the beggar lad is too sad for you, but you like Sweet Choco? Antony asked incredulously. She dies! Hanyu shrugged. Well, yes, but her lover plants that magic tree on her grave and waters it with her tears and gets saved by the falling leaves and everything. It's beautiful. I'm never going to figure you out. There was a strange note in Antony's voice, a little wondering, a little helpless, a little sad. Sweet Choco it is, then. He raised the flute to his lips, and, oh gods, Hanyu had never thought that a person could feel as jealous of a bit of metal as he did right then. Hanyu needed to be better. He needed to stop thinking with his dick. But as Antony's mouth descended on the flute, the instrument suddenly seemed incredibly phallic. His master's lips flitted over the mouthpiece with such easy familiarity, strong and soft and gentle all at once. Maybe he should have looked silly with his cheeks puffing slightly, but he didn't. Then his fingers started moving over the flute as well, practiced and confident, which was almost too suggestive to be born. As the first achingly sweet notes filled the air, all Hanyu's traitorous, libidinous mind could think was, I'd sing for you too if you touched me that way. After a long moment, Antony looked over at him with one brow inquisitively raised, and Hanyu remembered that singing was exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He nodded his hands in his lap to hide his embarrassing response to an instrument. Could you start over? He managed. Antony rolled his eyes, but complied. Looking away from his master and the unfairly lucky flute granted him the composure necessary to remember words and how to form them. His voice wasn't exceptional like Kenta's, he knew. It had been lovely when he was a boy. Father Shu had called it one of the clearest, sweetest sopranos he'd ever heard. But puberty had put paid to that, leaving him with a pleasant but unremarkable baritone. Still, he could keep a tune and wasn't likely to actively offend his god's ears. He sang all the way to the end, when Sweet Choco's lovers lay under the tree and it shed all its leaves to cover her and hide her from the wicked lord, before he dared to look up at Antony again. The god was looking down at him with a strange eagerness. His lovely silver eyes traced over Hanyu's face slowly, intently, as if he were memorizing him. When their eyes met, Antony dropped his gaze and lowered the flute from his mouth. You're good, he said gruffly, and Hanyu flushed with pleasure. Not all that good. Hanyu tried for demur, but he thought he just sounded smug. Antony shot him a quelling look. Don't be stupid, but, Hanyu, you're nice to listen to. What more could a person ask of a voice? I suppose. Hanyu snuggled closer to his legs. That was fun. Let's do another. You pick this time. How about Sand in the Clouds? That's for children. Antony's eyes went round in exaggerated horror. Oh no! A song meant for people a few years younger than you? In front of this enormous audience? What will everybody think of us? Hanyu cackled, leaning against Antony as the last of the tension bled from his body. He hadn't ruined everything. Even stomping on Antony's pain and trying to seduce him right afterwards hadn't been enough to destroy his master's affection for him. They were together again, not just together, but bickering and teasing and actively enjoying one another. He could have dissolved right into the rug with the force of his relief. They played and sang their way through several more songs. Eventually, Hanyu had nestled so close that he was practically sitting on Antony's feet. The contact was wonderful. The music was wonderful. The sense of closeness was wonderful. Hanyu was sure that nothing could possibly improve the moment. He was immediately proved wrong when one of Antony's hands settled on his head, gently stroking his hair. I'm not good at saying things. The god was glaring down at the flute in his other hand, refusing to meet Hanyu's questioning gaze. But I want you to know that you're an incredibly special person, and I'm lucky to have you here with me. I was so surprised that you wanted to stay with me that I forgot to thank you for it. Theo reminded me that I ought to be clearer about that. So, thank you. Hanyu was crying well before his master's fumbling little speech was over. He curled around Antony's legs, hugging them tightly until he felt a chilly hand tugging him up. Antony's voice was irascible. Oh, come on, up here with me. There, that's better, isn't it? Having shifted his clutching grip from Antony's legs to his shoulders, Hanyu nodded into the god's neck. He was the lucky one. Maybe Asal was right that he needed coddling. But if this was coddling, who would want to be so perfect they didn't need it? He was forgiven and valued and cuddled up close to the man he loved. Antony's arm wrapped stiffly around his shoulders. Good crying? Hanyu nodded against the god's chilly skin again and savored the way his master relaxed at his confirmation. Well, Antony gave his shoulder an awkward pat, but didn't remove his arm. That's all right, then. And it was.